Over the years, I've used a lot of different accessories on my AR-15s and rifles in general, and I've basically figured out what I do and don't want on my rifles. And in this video, I'm going to tell you about 5 things I don't want to have to use on my AR-15s that I still sometimes do use. But the reasoning behind why I have to use them is there, which I'm going to share with you, but I'm also going to tell you about why I don't want to use them if they're absolutely not necessary. So this rifle you see right here doesn't have any of the 5 things we're going to talk about in this video, which is why it's a good example of kind of the culmination of everything I've decided I like in a rifle and nothing I don't. But I do have many other examples I'm going to share with you that have these items to give you an idea as to why I have to use them even if I don't want to. Now, before we get started, I want to mention that Midway USA is the biggest supporter of the channel, and thanks to them I can get out here, give you information like this, and of course test out gear and equipment and generate informed opinions about said gear and equipment. So a big thanks to Midway USA for supporting this channel. Now, let's get into it. I'm going to pull out every different example I have of these items that I still currently use, but I'm going to tell you why I wish I didn't have to with each one, and hopefully this will help you generate a better opinion about whether or not it's stuff that you need too. All right, first on the list is going to be vertical or angled foregrips and hand stops. Now you can see on this setup right here, I have a vertical foregrip. Go ahead and check that, make sure we're good. And I don't like them at all. In fact, I'd rather not use them ever. Of course, I still do, which we'll talk about here in a second, but I want to give you the 2 reasons why I don't like them to begin with, and then I'll tell you why I'm still using one. Now, the first reason is that when you're using any type of cover or a barrier, it can be an impedance. Now, it does feel good to be able to drive your rifle into that cover or that barrier and get a really stable shooting position, but you don't always have that option. And sometimes you have to go on top of something that's a little bit more organic or round in shape, and the next thing you know, this thing actually becomes a real issue because now you have this really small surface area that you're trying to balance on top of something, and it becomes even less stable than if you just had nothing on there at all. So even though there's times on the range where I'm like, man, I really love having a vertical foregrip or a hand stop to drive the rifle into to get that stable shooting position, the second you try to do the same thing at like a car hood or something like that, it could be really problematic and it makes you even less stable. And that's one of the reasons why I'd prefer just not to have it at all, because the flat bottom of your rail works very well for that without any type of grip or hand stop or anything else there. Now, the other reason I don't like it is that when I have the rifle slung in front of me and I'm walking for any period of time, the vertical foregrip or the hand stop will just start stabbing me in the top of my thigh. And over time, that starts to hurt and be a little uncomfortable. And the smaller the grip or the hand stop is, the more it hurts because it gets a little bit sharper, basically, right? So I'd rather not do that. If I'm going to walk around with my rifle for a long period of time, I'm going to worry about a little bit more comfort and a little less the 0.0001% chance of me actually needing the rifle. And if I do need it, guess what? This isn't going to make a huge difference for me unless it does. Now, you're going to ask, well, then why do you have a vertical foregrip on here? Well, this is a 10.5-inch setup, right? So this is a Midwest Industries upper. Really nice upper, works very well. I like it quite a bit, but there's not a lot of rail space because it's much shorter. And you can see here I have a laser aiming module. This is a D-Ball D2. And I also have a light, which is a 6-hour Foxtrot MSR. Pretty good light, actually, for the money. Now, because of that, I have a pressure switch right here for the light. And then I have a pressure switch on the back of the D-Ball, which is just its activation switch. And I need to be able to activate those while still maintaining good control of the rifle while having very limited space to work with. So one of the best ways to do that is by using a vertical foregrip like this BCM you see right here. And as you can see, by putting my hand on here, partially, I'm not holding it like this, it's a partial grip. I'm coming up here and I can easily activate my pressure switch, easily activate my D-ball, and I can still drive the gun back into my shoulder to maintain control over recoil. So in this situation, it's almost a necessity, not to mention it keeps my hand away from my sling swivel that you see right here, because sometimes trying to get your hand on that can be very uncomfortable as well. So for this particular setup and for some of my shorter setups in general, I do use vertical foregrips because of being able to activate everything and still maintain control over the firearm. But in any other scenario where that's not a requirement, I try to ditch them as often as humanly possible for the first 2 reasons that I mentioned. So it is also a little extra weight. Even if it's 0.5 ounces, that's still extra weight. So it's nice to get any extra weight off the gun that we can. Regardless of that, let's talk about number 2. All right, next on the list is going to be pressure switches, which I generally don't like, but still seem to have to use. So here we have a 20-inch PSA build, which was voted on by you. So thanks for the input there. Nice and clear. And all the accessories on it are with budget in mind, including the Crimson Trace flashlight you see right here, which came with a pressure switch, which that's pretty cool, I would say. However, there are some things that I want to tell you about when it comes to pressure switches that I just don't like. And then I'm going to tell you why I'm still using one here. So the first thing I don't like about pressure switches is that they're generally more fragile. They usually fail much sooner than a tail cap switch would fail. And of course, they have snag points when it comes to the wiring. And in general, they're just less trustworthy than a tail cap switch. Not to mention, this one's very cheap. And so if the more expensive ones from Surefire, let's say, tend to fail, what makes me have any trust in this one? So pressure switches, they're fragile, and I don't want my guns to be fragile, and you're adding a point of fragility for a lot of times, no reason. The other reason I don't like pressure switches is that it adds complexity to the system. You need to worry about cable management, you need to worry about where your hand placement is, you need to make sure you don't have negligent discharges of light, especially at night. So it does add complexity to the system overall, which is something that I could do without if possible. Now, why do I still have one on this rifle? Well, to get a sling in the position I wanted on this M16A4 style rifle, which, is a little bit older and doesn't have all the fancy QD attachments like some of our more free float rails do, I had to add a Midwest Industries front sight base adapter mount, whatever it's called, up here at the front, which gave me Picatinny rail on both sides of the sight as well as a QD attachment point, which is very cool because it lets me put my sling where I want and it gives me the option for mounting a light. However, in order to run this light with the tail cap switch, I would want it on this side of the rifle, on the left side, because that way I could reach up with my hand, activate the switch, and not have any issues. But in order to run my sling where I need it, it has to be on the left side of the rifle. And if I put the flashlight up there, I can no longer have the sling swivel there. So in order to accommodate both of the things that I need on this rifle in order to have it set up and ready to go, I had to choose what was best for the sling, because the light has the option for the pressure switch, which I can just install here on the handguard. So if I didn't have to worry about the sling being here, I'd rather have the light here with a tail cap. But I have to worry about the sling being here. This is where I want it to be. So because of that, the light goes on the other side, the pressure switch is right here to activate it, and we're still in business, just not as ideally as I would prefer, but I'm limited by circumstance. So that is the situation with pressure switches. I try to avoid them now where I can, but in certain setups, in certain situations, it's the only real way to go, and that's what we have right here. So let's move on to the next thing I don't want to put on my rifle if I don't have to. The third thing on this list is actually buttstock storage. Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy, but let me explain. First off, here we have a clear rifle with an A2 buttstock on it, and of course on the back of this we have a storage compartment. Now there's nothing wrong with having the storage compartment, but I just don't personally use it. Now, of course in the past I have, but now I try to limit the amount of stuff that I strap to my rifle or add to it unnecessarily to help keep weight down and just eliminate any additional rattling or anything else like that. Now, of course, I make cleaning kits and all kinds of stuff you can put in here, but that does add additional weight to the system. And I've gone out of my way in the past to get buttstocks that had storage compartments, and those stocks tend to be more expensive, and now it's a feature I don't really use anymore. I might keep an extra battery in the pistol grip just to have a little bit of redundancy, but I try really hard to minimize the amount of extra weight I put on the rifle, and the buttstock storage usually leads to you adding more stuff than you even actually need to. So that's just something I don't add to my rifles anymore. Of course, if they already have it, like an A2 stock would, no big deal. But I'm not going to go out of my way and get, let's say, a Magpul ACS stock just to have that additional storage. And like I said, it is more expensive. And the only real problem with it is that I don't use it. So let's go on to the next one. All right, so the fourth item on this list is actually 45-degree offset sights. Whether or not they're iron sights or red dot sights, I don't want them on my rifle anymore if I don't have to. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of reasons as to why, and of course, I'll give you one reason why you might have to use them regardless. So here we have a rifle with an offset red dot mount here mounted on the receiver. We'll go ahead and double check that, make sure we're good to go there. And of course, it's on the wrong side of the rifle because I wanted to use it for demonstration purposes in this video, and I don't actually use it. It should be on the other side. Now, why don't I like this? And why don't I like iron sights that are in the same configuration? The first reason is because it's a snag hazard. This will snag on just about everything you can think of. Your gear, brush, whatever you come in contact with, it's going to find a way to grab it. And that's problematic in a lot of different ways. Not to mention, these mounts or the 45-degree offset iron sights tend to be more fragile because they have to be somewhat minimalistic, and then they're like the first thing that makes impact. If you drop your rifle or if you get snagged on something, it has to take the full amount of force to get off of that. Whatever it is, I just don't like it. It's a little bit less on the risk versus reward scale for me than it should be. Now, the other thing I don't like about it is having to cant your rifle in order to use those sights properly. You have to cant the rifle over about 45 degrees in order to get behind the red dot or the iron sights to then properly use them. And that's not that big of a deal because a lot of people will argue that it's for emergency situations as a backup system anyway. But even in that scenario, you're now very limited on what positions will work properly for you while using that sighting system. And there's a lot of positions where you get down in the prone or behind a barricade or whatever it is where trying to tilt the rifle makes things a lot more difficult. So those are the reasons why I don't really like it, but there is one reason why you might have to use it, and that would be in this situation where you have a scope mount that's not quick detach, but you want to have an emergency sighting system, and there is no option to have a 12 o'clock mount for your red dot like you see right here. And in that scenario, then using a 45-degree offset might be your only option for having that secondary system. But in general, if I can avoid it, I'm going to. And as you can see, it's not that hard to avoid as long as you select the right equipment from the get-go. So 45-degree offset sights, they're just not my cup of tea. I'd prefer to avoid them at all costs, and luckily I have. So let's move on to the next item I don't want to put on my rifles anymore. The fifth and final thing on this list that I really try hard not to add to my rifles anymore is going to be muzzle brakes. Now this Romanian Draco right here has quite the muzzle brake on it, and it's a JMac Customs X360 hub, I believe is what it's called. Regardless, it is a very loud muzzle brake, and I don't like using them when I don't have to. The main reason for that is that they're extremely concussive. They're loud and they don't really mitigate flash at all, and so you're giving away your signature in a very loud fashion. And so it kind of defeats the purpose of everything you want out of a tactically driven firearm setup besides helping with recoil. And yes, it does help reduce recoil quite a bit, but that reduction in recoil isn't worth the amount of signature it outputs in order to accomplish that. And the only reason I use this muzzle brake, and the only reason I would use any additional muzzle brakes in the future, is as a suppressor host, which is what this is. This allows me to direct thread my suppressor right onto the muzzle brake and get concentricity, which means it's actually lined up properly with the barrel in order to avoid having baffle strikes. And you can't do that very easily with AKs, so in order to get that job accomplished, I had to get this JMac Customs muzzle brake, which then allows me to put a suppressor on safely. Otherwise, I just wouldn't be using a muzzle brake at all. I would use a flash hider of some kind, or no flash hider, but definitely not a muzzle brake. And that's just why I don't want to use those anymore. They're very loud, and yes, they do help with recoil, but man, you're paying a big price for that. And it is definitely not pleasant to shoot around someone else who's using a muzzle brake because it's so concussive, it's very distracting. So that's the last thing on the list. I won't use muzzle brakes unless I absolutely have to, like in this situation. But for me, it doesn't really matter because I'm using this rifle suppressed 99% of the time. So let's just talk about some final thoughts here regarding why I don't like those things, and I'll bring back the rifle that has none of them. So those are the 5 things that I don't want to put on my rifles anymore unless I absolutely have to. And this rifle right here is the culmination of all that information. So in closing, I thought I'd just go over it real quick to demonstrate that none of those things are there. So, clear. As you can see, no hand stops or vertical foregrips. I do have a bipod on right now, but that is just quick detach. And I put it on here just so it's set on the workbench well. And I use it here and there for zeroing a new optic or something like that. And you also can tell that there's no pressure switches either. This top rail is actually pretty empty, but I do have a light here with a tail cap switch that works very well. I do not have any buttstock storage. This is just a standard BCM buttstock that's telescopic. And I don't have any 45-degree offset mounts anywhere. I have an additional red dot, but that is on top in the 12 o'clock position. Nothing 45 degrees hanging off of this rifle at all. And no muzzle brake. This is a flash hider, which is also a Silencer Co. ASR suppressor host. But even if I don't have the suppressor on, I'm still using the flash hider, not a muzzle brake. So hopefully this gives you some things to consider. I'm not trying to say that those other items I discussed are bad or not necessarily useful. All I'm saying is that if I can avoid using them, I will. And sometimes, especially in my experience, I've put things on my rifle just because I could, and I didn't really ask whether or not I should. And now I've learned why I don't necessarily want those things, And I've also learned about when I need those things, even if I don't want them. So let me know in the comments below if you had the same experience or if you have any differing opinions about some of the accessories discussed here. And of course, if you need anything else from me, go to magicprepper.com. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.